Hello and welcome to membership in the Evangelical Covenant Church. My name is John and I will be your guide through this membership curriculum. The first two parts of this membership curriculum you will be receiving digitally, and at the end of each of those parts, and actually interspersed in the second part, you will have some discussion questions. So whether you're doing this with a group, whether you're doing this virtually with a virtual small group, or whether you're doing this on your own and will process this with a pastor or lay leader later, welcome. This is your opportunity to learn more about the denomination and the church that you are joining. Like I said, the first two parts of this curriculum are things that are universal to the Evangelical Covenant Church. The third part will be a little bit more about the local congregation that you are joining. In the first part, we will discuss covenant history. The Evangelical Covenant Church has a long and storied history, going back long before 1885, when the covenant was founded here in the United States and Canada. And we could spend an entire semester, in fact, North Park Theological Seminary students do spend an entire semester learning about covenant history. But for the purposes of simply being a covenant member, what we want to do is spark your interest and give you a little bit of background into how the covenant church has come into the place that it is today. So if you feel like, wow, this is going really quickly, feel free to pause and rewind. Feel free to stop and talk with somebody near you, ask questions. If you have a facilitator leading this group, ask them about the things that we're discussing. And just know that you're not getting the full picture here. We can only do so much with the time that we have. So, without taking any more of that time, let's launch into the first section, which is called Covenant History for members. The first thing that you should know about the Evangelical Covenant Church is that we are a Reformation Church. What this means is that we came out of the Protestant Reformation in 1517 with Martin Luther. If you have never heard of the Protestant Reformation before, we'll talk a little bit about it here, but we're not going to go into great detail. And it really is something that you should study if you're part of a Protestant church. It is the moment in history when the Protestant church separated itself from what we now know as the Roman Catholic Church. So if you've ever wondered, well, why do Catholics believe some things and Protestants or other Christians, as we are often referred to, believe other things? Well, a lot of it goes back to 1517 and the Protestant Reformation, the split of that denomination. But it wasn't the first Reformation that occurred in the church. Going all the way back to the early days of Christianity, which of course took place during the 1st century, the early church had its own internal strifes. We learn about theological differences in the New Testament in the book of Acts and the subsequent epistles written by many of the apostles. We learn through church history about many of the ecumenical councils that took place in the first 1,000 years of the church, where theology was hotly debated and discernment was made into the creeds and confessions that most of the church share today in common. And in 1054, there was another split, the first major split of denominations in church history, and that's the Great Schism with the Eastern Orthodox Church. So, without going too much into the rest of that, what does it mean that we are a Reformation church, and specifically that we came out of the Protestant Reformation and the work of Martin Luther in 1517? Well, to understand why the Protestant Reformation happened, you have to know a little bit about what Martin Luther believed about the church. The most important thing for Martin Luther, or one of the most important things I should say to Martin Luther, was that lay people, that is anyone who's not an ordained priest, be allowed to and have access to the Bible in a common language to them. Martin Luther was in Germany, but he believed that the Bible should be translated into all of the languages of the world, so that any person in any walk of life, provided that they had some basic level of reading, could pick up a Bible and learn the story of Jesus, learn to read the Psalms as devotional practice, learn to know the story of God and therefore be able to place themselves in the story of God. And so with this increased emphasis on Scripture, Martin Luther launched what was, among 94 other things, the Protestant Reformation. And when I say 94, I'm not being superfluous or hyperbolic. He literally had 95 problems with the Catholic Church, and one of them, this one about Scripture, is where the Evangelical Covenant Church really finds its roots. The issue is, shortly after the Protestant Reformation, where the Lutheran Church split off, as well as many other churches, and we're going to see here in a moment a family tree where you're going to be able to visualize these things a little bit better. That when the Lutheran Church split off from the Catholic Church, they immediately returned to doing some of the same state church things or government church things that the Catholic Church had been guilty of just a generation before. By 1600, less than 100 years later, this Lutheran Church of Germany, the State Lutheran Church of Germany, was engaging in many of the same practices that many German theologians at the time felt Martin Luther had waged his Reformation over. In many ways, this is the story of human history, that people return to the same oppressive forms of leadership because it is what we know. And so because the State Church of Germany, the Lutheran Church of Germany, though it was a Protestant Reformation church, was doing many of the same things that the Catholic Church had been doing only 100 years before, another Reformation took place, this time within the Lutheran Church. And that Reformation is known as Pietism. Pietism, founded by Philipp Jakob Spener of Germany, was the movement to attempt to complete the Reformation. The idea here was that the Reformation had not been fully realized, or that the precepts and intentions of the Reformation had not been fully realized. And without meeting those goals, there was still work to be done. Namely, Spener really wanted to see the Bible find its way into common household life. And he wanted to see Christians not just reading the Bible alone as a form of study, or in the context of preaching, as was done in the church, but actually to read the Bible in small groups. These are known as Conventicles, groups that could process the text together, that could ask the really hard questions of the Bible and learn with one another so that they could do life together. These were wildly popular among people in Germany and throughout Western Europe and Scandinavia, but they were not popular among the state church. Because, in the same way that the Roman Catholic Church had withheld the Bible from modern or average people to try and retain a semblance of control, and had not wanted it to be translated into common languages, so the state church did not want to lose their grip on that newfound control that they had. And so this Pietism spread much like many movements of Christianity against the oppressive structures that sought to impede it. There were governmental edicts, especially in the places where Pietism was most prevalent, and eventually we find our way all the way up into the 19th century with a man named C.O. Rosenius. He was a Swede, and even though Pietism was originally a German concept, founded by Spener in the German Lutheran Church, because Sweden was had a Lutheran state church as well, many Pietists, as Pietism spread in Sweden, similarly to how it had been spreading for the last 200 years in Germany. Similarly, there were edicts against things like conventicles, where people would read together. There were laws that were put forward to try and attempt to squash the movement of the church. But as we know, whenever you try and squash a religious movement, especially one with God on their side, they tend to flourish under that oppression. And so, under C.O. Rosenius's leadership, the Mission Friends of Sweden began to flourish in the 19th century in Sweden. Rosenius was an amazing and impactful leader, but if the Pietist movement in Sweden, the Mission Friends, the läseri, or the readers as it is in Swedish, had stayed in Sweden, we wouldn't have the Evangelical Covenant Church that we have today. And so, and another important thing to realize in history is that during the same time that the Pietism movement was finding its crescendo in the country of Sweden, specifically against the state church under C.O. Rosenius with the Mission Friends, there was also a mass emigration from Sweden. And these new immigrants were going primarily to 3 places, and they were all in the same country. They were going to Chicagoland, they were going to Michigan, and they were going to Minnesota. So, over the next 100 years, 1.4 million Swedes make their way from the country of Sweden to the United States and primarily land in these locations, in small, tight-knit communities, where they set up churches of their own. Some of these reflected the state church, or the state Lutheran Church of Sweden, with identity and theology. But many more of them reflected the Mission Friends identity that had been so prolific during that time. And those churches, those Mission Covenant churches, as they called themselves, began to pop up all over the Chicagoland area, Minnesota, and Michigan during the latter half of the 19th century. This moves us all the way up into 1885, when those churches joined together to create the Evangelical Covenant Church. But there's another important person that we haven't mentioned yet, and that is a Swedish theologian by the name of P.P. Waldenström. And he is important because he was, in many ways, not the leader of the Pietist movement, but the chief theologian of the Mission Friends. While C.O. Rosenius was leading the movement, P.P. Waldenström was one of its greatest advocates. And Waldenström was an ordained Lutheran minister who got himself into a lot of trouble by going after or questioning certain established theological principles related to general life in the New Testament. Especially, he had an issue with the wrath-based atonement structures that were in place at that time. If you don't know what wrath-based atonement is, it's probably the most popular view of atonement today in the American Evangelical Church. And wrath-based atonement says that in order for God to save the world through Jesus, God needed to take out his wrath on Jesus. And so the natural concept here, according to Waldenström, was that God had an issue that needed to be solved. That this was the fundamental issue with penal substitutionary atonement or any wrath-based atonement. And that he did not find anywhere in Scripture where that principle was clearly defined. And so he asks the State Church of Sweden a very simple and difficult question. He asks the question, where is it written? And in that question spawned the very core identity of what makes up the Evangelical Covenant Church. This question of returning to Scripture over and over, to not take theology at its face value, to not simply accept things because we've been told them, but rather to ask the fundamental question, is this biblical? Where is it written in the text? And can we return together, especially in a small group, and find that and perhaps change our minds? It's a really humbling opinion or a humbling stance to take on the New Testament and on Scripture or religion as a whole. It's an ability to say, I may be wrong. And this has been at the very core ethos of the Covenant Church since its inception. And so P.P. Waldenström gets in lots of trouble. He winds up coming to the United States, but that's a story for another day. I wanted to pull up here just so that you get a clear visualization. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. The family tree of the church. So at the bottom you can see Judaism as the roots of Christianity, Jesus obviously being a Jew, and then the person of Jesus and the Christians of the way, the 12 disciples, and the many other men and women, especially women, who made up the early church. You can see there that it becomes what we call the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. That is through the ecumenical councils. And we won't get into the ecumenical councils today, but essentially they were a system, a time in history where Christianity began to become systematized. There was certain decisions made about what books should be in the Bible and what the theological principles related to, for example, the Trinity are, and other things like that. But coming out of that, it was one unified church with a couple of smaller denominations spinning off, like the Coptics and the Armenians. That's when we hit that 1054 date, and we have the Eastern Orthodox Church, both the Russian and Greek Orthodox believers who branch off. Then we get all the way up about 500 years later to Martin Luther in the Protestant Reformation, where you can see a whole lot of splits happen. The Roman Catholic Church obviously continues off there to the left. Also the Anglican Church, although that's not precisely part of the Protestant Reformation. The Reformed Church under John Calvin, the Lutheran Church obviously under Martin Luther, and the Radical Reformers, which we're not going to talk a whole lot about today, but those are Mennonites and Brethren and other denominations like that. If you follow that Lutheran thread, you can see it becomes Pietist, and then there is another branch that goes off vertically there. That's the State Lutheran Church. And then the Pietism branch becomes a lot of different denominations: Moravians, the Free Church, the Baptist General Conference, and you can see it right up there, all the way to the farthest right, is the Evangelical Covenant Church, the Mission Covenant of Sweden. So, when they arrive in America, a lot of these churches come together to form what is called the Swedish Mission Covenant in America. This is important to note, that because the Swedish Mission Covenant Church was not defining themselves as being from America or of America at this point. They were simply the Swedes who still held on to their mission covenant identity in Sweden, but were now in America. It was initially made up of two main streams of believers: Swedish Baptists and Lutheran Pietist congregations in the Midwest. Again, Minnesota, Chicagoland, and Central Michigan. What was interesting about these two groups is that they agreed on very little theology. But they did agree on one thing, and that was that they were specifically non-confessional. An important thing to understand about the Evangelical Covenant Church is that we are non-confessional. We hold to many of the creeds developed in the early days of the church during that the ecumenical period, but we are non-confessional, meaning that we do not make anyone sign a statement of belief other than that Jesus is Lord. And this statement of belief, that Jesus is Lord, is the only confession that the Evangelical Covenant Church holds to. All other confessions are considered outside of the boundaries of what it means to be covenant. Now, that doesn't mean that individual believers have not signed confessions or would not confess to certain things. In fact, having strongly held opinions is a lot of what it means to be a covenant believer, what it means to be a part of the covenant church. And congregations may have their own confessional identities, although it becomes extremely dangerous when their members begin to sign those confessions. But at least at the beginning, there was a very heavy emphasis on being non-confessional. And this is what separated, in many ways, the Evangelical Covenant Church, or at that point what we call the Swedish Mission Covenant in America, from the Swedish Lutherans or anyone else, or the Baptists from the Swedish Baptists, or the Baptists in the United States, the Baptist General Conference, is that these groups wanted these newfound independent Swedish mission churches to sign statements of belief, especially the Augsburg Confession. They felt that in order to be a church within their denomination, they had to sign that. And so these two groups, who agreed, like I said, on almost no theology, decide that it's better to be united around being non-confessional than to be a part of larger independent or larger denominations where they would be forced to be confessional. And what's important here is that it is not that they did not believe the words of the confession. In fact, many of the Swedes, even in the very early days of the Swedish Mission Covenant, would say that they held to all of the precepts of the Augsburg Confession. The problem was they just didn't like the idea that they might be signing a confession, and then later the question might be asked, where is it written, of any measure or piece of that confession, and that would have to be held to a biblical standard. And if it wasn't, they would feel disingenuous that they had signed that confession in the first place. I'm going to read from a book called Glad Hearts, and it's a collection of quotes and passages of famous covenant historians. And I'm going to read from specifically a man by the name of C.V. Bowman, who was one of the first presidents in the Evangelical Covenant Church and who was around during the time period when the Swedish mission covenant started in the United States. It says, concerning church order, the mission friends have a principle that is still more unique and takes a very prominent place in their program. They hold that the local church should consist of only believing members, but at the same time should have room for all true believers, no matter what their viewpoints are on controversial doctrines. It is this principle which really distinguishes the mission friends from other church denominations and which justifies the existence as a particular church. Why this is important is that as we continue to move through this time, you will see time and time again, especially in the sixth affirmation, which we'll cover in section 2, that the Covenant Church has a long history of being quite theologically diverse. And right at the beginning, that commitment to theological diversity and the holding of minority theological opinions was paramount for the people who founded the denomination. In fact, as C.V. Bowman says here, it is that which justifies their existence as a particular church. It is what justifies the existence of the Evangelical Covenant Church, rather than just having the covenant be part of another denomination. So now that we've talked about the founding of the Evangelical Covenant Church, we need to talk about what happened in the first 125 years of the denomination's life together. Obviously, as we said already, the Evangelical Covenant Church began with two very conflicting streams coming together, the Pietists and the Baptists. The Baptists made up a minority of that group, but they had a fairly conservative understanding of Scripture. Think of the Baptist Church of today. Many of the same theological principles existed then. And chief among these was the issue, unsurprisingly, of baptism. The Lutheran mission friends had held to the Lutheran understanding of baptism, which practiced almost exclusively infant baptism. They joined together with another group of people who almost universally despised infant baptism. Anybody who knows the Baptist Church will know that the Baptist Church in many cases rebaptizes, or most often rebaptizes, people who have been baptized as infants because they don't even view it as a valid form of baptism. When these two groups came together, they agreed to disagree on this, and this marks a very important moment in the history of the church. This was by no means the only controversy in the early years. Things like evolution and the debates over creationism and evolution were raging even then. There were many and more debates over the place of women, over the plight of African Americans in this country. And we're going to see as the timeline moves on how the covenant handles some of those things. But it's important to begin right off the bat, before the covenant was even established, that they were willing to hold a dissonance on a central core tenet of what it means to be a Christian, how we practice liturgically the sacrament of baptism. And so in the first 125 roughly years of the Evangelical Covenant Church, this kind of uniquely accommodating spirit continues, and it allows the church to be somewhat progressive in relationship to other evangelical denominations. Much more like mainline Protestant denominations in the United States, with how quickly they're able to adopt certain cultural understandings of things and encompass those into their life together. And again, a big part of this is that whenever a controversy came up, it was not considered to be a great, huge issue to simply go back to the text and ask the fundamental question that it all began with: where is it written? And so you can see here on our timeline just a couple of different things that have been pointed out. The first one is full support of civil rights in the year 1963. This is, of course, an important year because it's the year when the March on Washington with Dr. Martin Luther King happened. And it was at that time, it was Dr. Martin Luther King was extremely unpopular in most evangelical circles. But the Evangelical Covenant Church was one unique example where, because of a commitment to dissonance, meaning they didn't have to have all of the churches in full and complete agreement, they were able to move and resolve to support the civil rights movement. Sometimes in vastly superior moral ways to their counterparts in the evangelical church. Only 13 years later, women's ordination becomes a hot topic in the Covenant Church in the early 70s and eventually is passed in 1976. We'll get into that in a moment as well. In 1992 and 2007, we have resolutions on the environment. Again, a hot topic even today. And in 2002, in direct response to a lot of the Islamophobic rhetoric surrounding the 2001 tragic events on 9/11, the Evangelical Covenant Church comes out with a repudiation of Islamophobia. The ECC has carried on this progressive spirit in many ways, participating in anti-racism. We have an entire department devoted to Love Mercy, called Love Mercy Do Justice, that talks about justice issues related to the church, issues involving immigration. The ECC has been really an oasis within American evangelicalism for these concepts, and it is really a beautiful thing, and it comes from the ability to ask those fundamental questions at their core. Perhaps the largest issue, again, just to return to women's ordination, since infant versus believer baptism at the inception of the Covenant Church, was women's ordination in 1976. And this really tested the denomination's ability to coexist in harmony, even though there was some theological dissonance. And so there were churches that do not hold to women's ordination. They did not want to call a female pastor. Some clergy even spoke out and speak out to this day against women preachers. But again, there has been a shared commitment to hold that theological dissonance. The picture you see here, just to give you some context for this, this is just kind of a fun fact, is a man by the name of Douglas Cedarleaf. And he was one of the early covenant pastors who really spurred on the white covenant church's involvement in the civil rights movement. This picture here is Cedarleaf holding an American flag as him and his church sing, lift every voice and sing, as they march through the streets of their local Chicago neighborhood, escorting a black family to their home that had recently been vandalized by people who were unhappy that the neighborhood was being integrated. And so you can see here, putting their bodies on the line, putting their reputations on the line to be servants of Christ, even in the midst of difficult and dangerous circumstances. And so as we end this section, I just want to reaffirm for all of you, there's so much more in covenant history. There are so many amazing stories that in their own right could be turned into movies, and there have been books written about them. There are so many amazing characters. I didn't even mention David Nybal, who's probably the most important covenanter in history. I didn't mention that we have a university called North Park University, and that was founded during kind of in the midst of all of this. There's so much more to learn about the ECC historically, but just for the purposes of this history is intended to serve as your springboard into the affirmation. So if you have more questions, there are a lot of resources that are going to be at the available wherever this curriculum is found for you. Things like By One Spirit, which is a fairly robust history of the Covenant Church up until a certain point. Things like Glad Hearts, which is again a collection of texts and primary sources of covenant covenant thinkers throughout the years. And there's so much more to learn. So I really encourage you, if this is interesting to you, to dive deeper, to get more information about the ECC, because it really is an amazing and a robust history. And I hope that you can spend some time to do that. But now we're going to move into the 6 affirmations of the Evangelical Covenant Church.